Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to talk about workload, recovery, and kind of chronic training / consistency. All right, this is a topic we've talked about before, but it kind of bears repeating, especially at this period in the year when people have essentially been playing for 9 months in some cases, right? So what are we looking at every time we kind of see somebody with an injury? Well, the first place that a lot of kind of parents, coaches, athletes may want to go is the mechanical side. And while that absolutely plays a role, it definitely doesn't tell the whole story. Generally, the bigger factor in this is workload. And so one of the things that we're seeing is not only are guys playing for a really long period of time without, kind of enough training in there to kind of change the physiology in a meaningful way, what they're also doing is they're just pitching too frequently and then over a long time period. So what we're seeing is guys, you have a 5-game kind of tournament over the course of a weekend. Guys are pitching multiple times in a weekend. What we've seen from our recovery metrics, so when we measure kind of ER/IR, when we measure kind of flexion extension at the elbow, when we measure some kind of more in-depth forearm measures and grip strength, what we're seeing is if we take a baseline of this and then we measure it kind of post-throwing and we continue doing it over the course of time, it takes generally roughly about 48 hours for those things to return to baseline if it's been a low volume pitching day. If it's been a higher volume day or you're somebody who recovers a little bit slower or throw really hard, it might take you 72 hours. So even if you only pitch an inning on like a Saturday, for example, if you're pitching again on Sunday or even Monday, you are not fully recovered. So what this means is that there are kind of important implications from here. So we know that the UCL cannot handle the stress from a throw on its own, right? It can handle, generally in cadaveric research, it's somewhere around kind of 37 Newton meters of stress. And we're seeing well above that during the throw, right? In some cases between 70 and 90. And so what that's equivalent to, right, on kind of those mid ranges is essentially if you held somewhere between a 55 and 75 pound kettlebell behind you during layback, all right? And so what kind of happens in order for the UCL to not just blow up on every single throw is that the forearm musculature and other musculature kind of around the UCL helps support that and dissipate some stress. But what happens when that musculature is fatigued? Well, then more stress goes to the UCL. So why do we see not necessarily every UCL injury is one throw and then it's gone? It may build up over time and then all of a sudden you're like, man, I'm really sore on this day, and it just doesn't ever get built back up. You go get some imaging, you find out there's some kind of partial UCL tear. Likely that fatigue played a pretty big role, right? And kind of going even deeper into the fatigue side of things, it's not just how frequently are you pitching. It's also a matter of what are you doing outside of those games, practices, all those things. Are you recovering well, right? Is your training planned out in a manageable way that you can recover between sessions and you're not fatigued on the weekends when you're playing? Are you sleeping enough? Are you eating well? Is there other stress in your life, kind of emotional, psychosocial? All that stuff plays a role. So all those are important factors, and that's not really relevant to this conversation necessarily, but just something to be aware of that if you're in a really high stress period in your life, maybe it's not a great idea to go pitch 3 games in the weekend. Not that it ever is. The next piece to this is when we talk about kind of consistency and chronic training, right? So like the fall is a time period where, like, especially with our high school guys, they may be playing another sport. Right? So if you're playing, soccer, basketball, you're wrestling, you have practices for, the sports that are in the off season right now. You're doing all of those things. Maybe you're not training enough for baseball or throwing consistently enough where we've built that chronic load to a point where you can handle these kind of outings on the weekend, right? So when that happens, you're throwing once a week or maybe no times a week and then still pitching on the weekends as if you're in season. We spike that workload, right, every single time we go out there. And so while one inning may not seem like a lot, and you're like, man, why can't I do this? I've been able to do this before. A couple of things are happening. One, we know from the workload research that when you get above about 30% workload from the previous session, previous week, whatever, we're kind of measuring those acute and chronic timelines on. All right, when we get above that 30% marker, our injury risk increases substantially. When we get above the 50% number, we essentially double our injury risk. All right, so it's there's really significant implications in terms of not training enough or not throwing enough and then still pitching on the weekends. All right, so kind of the next piece to that is the fatigue thing we talked about before. If you have 5 soccer practices a week and your warm-up for soccer practice is a mile before you even get to the field or before you even get to the kind of skill stuff, right? You're probably pretty tired by the end of the week, and then you've got games and travel and all that kind of stuff on top of that. To then go pitch, again, we're going to be dealing with systemic fatigue, maybe not localized fatigue like we talked about in the forearm necessarily, but we have this systemic fatigue, all right? So the body is not going to work as well. The central nervous system isn't going to work as well, right? Those kind of local musculature isn't going to work as well. So we have all of those things going on, all right? And then kind of the final piece to this is that eventually, everybody's going to have to kind of come to the point where they can realize that they're not going to be able to do what they've done their entire lives to maybe that point. And so usually this realization kind of comes sometime around 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, depending on the guy, that, you know, when I was 8 years old, I could play soccer and then go to baseball, and like my first baseball practice, I could go throw 50 pitches and I felt totally fine. And that's okay when you throw 40 miles an hour, right? You just don't throw hard enough to hurt yourself in all likelihood. Once you throw 80 or 85 or 90 miles an hour, you can no longer get away with things like that. And obviously, that's an extreme example. You're probably not going to go do that your first time out. But it's similar to that effect when you're doing that every weekend and not keeping up the training throughout this time period. All right, so we want to be very careful about our workloads, kind of managing fatigue and all of these things when we're talking about what does our injury risk look like and what should our training look like. Thanks for tuning in.